So one day I was in Rome, Massachusetts on a seminar on civic organization, and we had a nice discussion, and a young man in his 30s raised his hand and he said, I'm from Weehawken, New Jersey, 14,000 people, very depressed city, deindustrialized, crumbling infrastructure, and I wanted to do something about it because everybody was grumbling, but everybody also agreed that something had to be done. You had to repair things, you had to upgrade things, and so on. So he decided to go to the town meeting, which is a regular occurrence, and he was the only one there. So he looks around and he says, something wrong with me? He's the only one who showed up. The $2 bill is on the window because the $2 bill has on one side, in 1776, the white males who showed up to sign the Declaration of Independence, which they thought was their death sentence. They were challenging the most powerful monarch and military in the world by name. They put their name on it, as we know. And whatever you say about them, they're white males. Some of them had slaves. They referred to Native Americans as savages in the Declaration of Independence. They were really state-of-the-art in terms of the world at that time. So the idea is, aren't we glad they showed up? Why aren't we showing up? Number one problem in democracy. If you don't show up, nothing happens. Zero. And we live in an electronic age where people walk across the street without looking at the traffic because they're looking at their cell phone. People are spending huge amounts of time looking at screens. An average 10-year-old is now at 8 hours a day. 8 hours a day looking at screens. There was a survey of women at Baylor University, 10 hours a day. They were looking at screens. Their computer, their cell phone, television. What happens when somebody shows up? Well, I'll give you an example. This used to be my mother's restaurant, all this whole area. I know every square foot because I worked it. And there came a time in the mid-60s where the high school down the street emptied out and moved to another building that used to be an orphanage, started by the same industrialist, William Gilbert, the famous Gilbert clock factory. And the factories were fleeing. You can see them, they're empty factory buildings everywhere. And people were unemployed. And most of the jobs they had to go to Hartford, New Britain, Waterbury for. And my brother thought this would be a good place for a community college. And he was told that there is no town this small in the country with a community college. Forget it. He was also told there was no community college in Connecticut. And you're going to start it here in depressed Winston. So he started studying up on community colleges while he was working 7 days a week in a restaurant. And one thing about a restaurant, this is not a fast food restaurant, there was a lot of discussion. They used to say, Nader's restaurant, for a dime, you got a cup of coffee and 10 minutes of political conversation. So he started talking with people. Most of them were skeptics. Most of them didn't want to have any part of a will-o'-the-wisp idea. But there were about 7 or 8 who said, okay, Shaft, tell us what we can do and we'll help. And so at 1 o'clock when the restaurant closed in the morning, he formed a window tapping club. And so they would come by and they'd tap on the window and he'd come here, he'd give them coffee and sandwiches, whatever, and they would plan it. And it occurred in about 1 year. And it opened in the fall of 1965. And it is now the top-rated community college in Connecticut. One person with a small number of supporters did it. The lesson, 1% or less of the people who are civically engaged, representing what a majority of people think are needs, necessities, just silent majority opinion, can accomplish almost anything. Can overcome very powerful corporate forces. There are no corporate forces opposed to community college. but there's huge lethargy, huge apathy, huge disillusionment, huge depression about the town. The young people would just graduate high school, go to college, leave it. So there are different kinds of opposition. A number of years later, the 100-year-old hospital established by a philanthropist, two philanthropy families, it was the first hospital in the county, closed. It got stuck in the whole healthcare miasma, wasn't the best managed, and it closed. So it left 33,000 people without any urgent care, emergency care. And my sister and Charlene Lavoie, Claire Nader, Charlene Lavoie, said, this has got to change. And so they got a petition, 12,000 people signed it in a very short time.
In 10 days.
In 10 days. 10 days. People were scared. You know, you have an emergency, child, rush, you know, nothing. So now there's the Winstead Health Center. And it has, it's open 12 hours a day, and it has everything but overnight beds. So it does serve a very important purpose. Everybody said it would never happen. Well, guess what? It has never happened in America before. In other words, when a hospital closes in our country, nothing takes its place, except here. Two people, volunteers, supporters, talk them out. They said it couldn't be done. How many times do we have to learn this lesson? That's the lesson of America. It's never been more than 1%. Take the most mass movement in our recent memory, civil rights movement. It never was close to 1% of engaged, active people. How do I define that? Well, let's define it by way of a hobby. People have hobbies. They collect stamps, collectible cars, coins, you know, they watch birds. The average hobby, I'm told, takes 200 to 500 hours a year and $300 to $500 a year that a person spends on the hobby. Now, if we had civic hobbies, if we had a Congress Watch group in every congressional district that would watch Congress on many issues that grab people, but they don't have time to be involved. In other words, they reflect majority opinion. Congress would be transformed. Congress, the big secret in Congress, is not only bought and paid for, it's a civic pushover once the people arouse themselves. How much? Less than 1%. If you had 2 million people in this country, distributed in 435 districts, and they're all networked around a transformational agenda. Living wage, full Medicare for all, free choice of doctor. Let's do all the long overdue changes that Europe has had in Canada and so on. And new ones too, like significant enforcement against corporate crime, fraud, and abuse. Or the establishment of cooperatives, customer-owned businesses, like we have food co-ops around the country. Or pulling back on empire, ending militarizing of U.S. foreign policy, where brute force is the first option. That's the first option now. Go and kill it. Drones, special forces, who cares about international law, national sovereignty? Go and kill it. That's really working pretty well for our security, isn't it? We start out with a criminal gang in northeast Afghanistan, and now we have huge fighters against us in 25 countries, growing by the day. And the more we use brute force instead of waging peace, which historically has been much more successful, all we're getting is boomerang and the coming visits here, which will destabilize our country because we can't take terrorist explosions without going into total nervous breakdowns, massive media coverage, forgetting everything important about what we have to do. And don't think people don't know that overseas. In Baghdad, something like San Bernardino happens every other day, multiplied by 2. They have a functioning city of sorts. But we couldn't do that because we've been spoiled. We've been too safe for too long from these types of attacks. So when they happen, we allow the people who profit from these attacks, contracts, media ratings, politicians stifling dissent. There's a lot of profit in this so-called fight against terrorism. They want to stir us up and get us stir crazy over 10 fatalities, 3 fatalities, 20 fatalities, while we forget that today 700 people in this country will die from hospital negligence and hospital-induced infections and misprescription of drugs. That's, whenever you hear anybody utter a fact, I think you agree with me, you got to say, what's your evidence? Okay, it's a March 2016 peer-reviewed study by Johns Hopkins University Medical School. And they said that's the minimum figure, 700 a day. Minimum in the US, every day. And it's silent violence, it's not shooting, but it's preventable. The key is not who caused it, the key is how do you prevent it? You've got to prevent it. And these are hugely preventable casualties, like washing your hands if you're a doctor and you're a nurse. That's cut down on casualties from patient to patient. But we don't pay attention to that kind of thing because they stir us up with these fight against terrorism. That's a $5 trillion business operation in the last 10 years. That's big money for Lockheed Martin, for the helicopter industry, for the security industry, for the guards, for the privacy invaders, for the dossier collectors. Big money. That's why we have to start locally. Here's why we have to start locally. Because when you get away with this ideological fights, red state, blue state, polarized, so on, and Bill mentioned some of the issues where people are divided. When you get down to where people live, work, and raise their family, ideology starts disappearing. Why? Because have you met a conservative right-wing family that listens to Rush Limbaugh every day say, I don't want my children to breathe clean air, eat safe food, or have safe medicines, or drink clean water, because I listen to Rush Limbaugh. I'm a right-winger. See what happens when you get down? I once talked to a guy who was so extreme, he didn't believe in doors on cars. if they're regulated. If they're regulated. And I said to him, well, what if the company sold you a car with an engine mount that led to stick throttle, so the car takes off on you without a notice? Would you want that company to recall your car? After all, you paid that company good money. Yeah, but what if the company didn't want to recall that car? Would you want a little law and order? You don't use the word regulation. Would you want a little law and order? You're darn right. My kids could be in that car. See what happens when you get down what semantics call the abstraction ladder. Once you get up abstract, you can get people fighting like crazy against each other. Religious wars, ideological wars, etc. Once you bring it down, it's completely different. Just the other day, there was an article yesterday in the New York Times. Muslim leaders and Jewish religious leaders had a meeting in, I think it was what's called Israel proper now. They weren't having it in the West Bank. And it was a brave thing to do, rabbis and religious Muslim leaders. And the New York Times reported it yesterday, it was in yesterday's Time. And they quoted a Muslim imam as saying, the issue with the Israelis has nothing to do with ideology and religious divisions. It has everything to do with theft of our land and our water and oppression of our people. See, he brought it right down. That's why we're meeting with the rabbis. See, he brings it down. This is an important technique in civic action. Bring it down the abstraction level. Then it becomes a matter of fact, evidence, myth, fraud, things that people interact with every day, right? That's what is very, very important to do. That's what I did in the consumer movement. I didn't talk about the theoretical concepts of nutrition, molecules, vitamins. I talked about dirty meat plants. I talk about dirty hot dogs. I would go on Mike Douglas' show, I'd say, here's a hot dog. It's got all kinds of stuff in it, additives, coloring agents, 30% fat, miscellaneous debris, but it tastes good, especially with mustard, right? So 35 years later, I meet someone on United Airlines, they say, I saw you on the Mike Douglas show. And I said, really? And what do you remember? I remember that hot dog. See? Now, I could have given an excursus on nutrition, right? Right? That's the key. That's why that tour museum is so important. Because every exhibit you see, you're going to say, I know a worker who got sick in asbestos. I know someone who's killed in that Pinto or injured. I heard about that. See? That's what we have to talk about. Because building a democracy is learning to use concrete language, infused with ethical norms. Because here's another commonality of most people. Fair play. Most people understand fair play. They may be Republicans, Democrats, red, blue, doesn't matter. When they are cheated by a vendor, they are just cheated consumers. They are not ideological left, right. And they react the same way. So those are important concepts. So 20 years from now, if someone asks you, what do you remember from this little session? Here's what I want you to remember. 1% or less. Because the biggest problem in getting people out is morale. It's convincing them that it's worth their time. It's convincing them that they're going to count if they show up. It's convincing them that they can build a better life for themselves in their neighborhood, in their community. And that takes convincing. And so they grow up in a school system that trains them to be powerless. That's what school does, among other things. It trains you to be a cog in a wheel. It trains you to be powerless. One time I came home from school, and my father, I think I might have been 10, and my father asked me, what did you learn in school today, Ralph? Did you learn how to believe, or did you learn how to think? I never forgot that in classes in future years. Is this teacher trying to teach me how to believe before teaching me how to think? So how do you get over this morale problem, which is wedded to a very rigid routine? All over the world, people are stuck in routines. Routines are often survival mechanisms. They're not useless. That's why they're so prevalent. But if they taken to an extreme, they prevent people from growing, from having new experiences. There are 90% of the people in this town in the last year have never been to this tour museum. There have been people from Germany, India, England, Mexico, California, all over the world. 95% of the people have never been to this tour museum. Routine. Oh, I'm too busy. I got to do this on Saturday. I got to do this on Sunday. I meant to go, but I'm just too busy. Routine is connected to the deadly scourge of procrastination. If you ever met anybody who doesn't procrastinate, you've met a visiting Martian. Okay? Everybody procrastinates. But again, there are levels of extremism to where you abort any kind of development, your own human experience, your own opportunities, your own desire to grow as a significant person. So the 1%, all the major movements of justice in our country, other than wars, never involved more than 1%. 1846, upstate New York, 6 women meet in a farmhouse. They launched the women's suffrage movement. At its peak in 1918, when they were all over the country getting arrested and beat up by cops. Can you imagine getting arrested and beat up by cops because you want to vote? Right in front of the White House this happened. Before the amendment was passed. There never was close to 1% of men and women devoting 200 hours or more a year to that cause. How come it won? How come the abolition of slavery movement, which had a fraction of 1/10 of 1%, it was so powerful, some people think it led to the Civil War. How about the farmer labor progressive movements in the late 19th century? Here's one out of East Texas. It started in 1887. The farmers were being mauled by the railroads' high freights to get their crops to market, and by the bank's high interest rates. Day after day, that's all they could think of. They were being put out of their livelihood by these two large corporations. And so the couple of them met and they said, look, we got more votes than the railroads and the banks. There are farmers everywhere. This is the main economy. Why are we taking this? So they started something called the lecturers. They went from farm door to farm door. And they had an agenda, not only regulating freights, not only regulating bank interest rates, but a very sophisticated concept of credit for farmers. Of credit's called the sub-treasury plan. They weren't just interested in tweaking the banks. They wanted a completely different flow of financial credit to get their expenses paid before the crops. You know, it was a yearly cycle. Listen to this. In 6 months, dirt poor East Texas, they signed up 200,000 farmers at $1 dues per farmer, which is $25 today. If we had a pending invasion of Mars, I don't think we could do that today. That's the difference. They had no screen to distract them. They had nothing to distract them. They just had each other's eyes, hearts, and feet. That's what they had. And it was never close to 1% as they fanned out all over the country, elected governors, state legislatures, and the early 20th century, almost the president. Most fundamental political movement in our history.
When did you unify?
And most people today going to college and high school, they hardly have a clue what it's all about. All right, so we start with the 1% or less in the local community. That would be 100 people here in Winston. Do I need to ask Charlene Lavoie what she would do with 100 people? Dedicating $200 to $500 a year, dedicating $200 to $500.
Yippee!
Volunteer. All these long overdue changes would click into action. Why? Because the other key ingredient is reflecting what Abraham Lincoln called the public sentiment, which is majority opinion. Now you might say, well, you know, majority opinion, that's a hard thing to generate. This is a polarized country. Aren't we told that every day? Democrats tell us, Republicans tell us. Do you realize that there are certain political forces that profit from a binary politics, red state, blue state? At least they have their own terrain, right? They may not win against the other party, but they come close. Divide and rule has been the strategy for over 2,000 years by whoever rules people, and every culture in the world, I learned from my anthropology class at Princeton, every culture in the world has severely concentrated power in the hands of the few. Now maybe the Hopi do it better than others, but it all ends up with a very small number controlling, if not owning, controlling the reins of power. whether they're religious groups or people who own property or military or whatever. So how do you build public opinion? You go down the abstraction ladder. You get concrete. And you say, okay, here you are, a nice auditorium full of people. Let's say 500 people, randomly pre-selected. There are Republicans, Democrats, there are people pro-choice, pro-life, there are people who work with their hands, there are people who push paper, there are people of different ethnic groups. Okay, all right. Are you all taxpayers? Yes. Okay, do you think that giant corporations who make hundreds of billions of dollars a year should get away paying no taxes or 5%? What do you pay? Hands go up. Well, I paid 22% last year. What do you pay? Well, I did pretty well. I paid 30% last year. What do you pay? Well, I didn't do very well at all, and I didn't have income to tax. Well, that's something that these big corporations don't have to endure, right? Like, well, the reason why General Electric didn't pay any taxes in 10 years when the 2000 year started, they made billions of dollars in US-based profits, paid zero income tax, and got refunds because they bought the liabilities of other companies. So a worker in Schenectady in a GE plant could say, I sent more dollars to the US Treasury in my pay, one person, than the billions of dollars of profitable GE. Now, do you think that's fair? I listen to Rush Limbaugh. Do you think that's fair? No, that's not fair. I buy The Nation magazine. Do you think that's fair? No, definitely I don't think so. You see how the fair play kicks in? That's the importance. You say, okay, let's try something else. Corporations are mismanaged. They say they love the free market. Part of the free market is the freedom to fail. Okay, they're losing sales, they're losing profits, red ink everywhere. But they're powerful enough to have connections with senators, representatives, executive branch agencies, contracts with the government. And so instead of failing, they go to Washington for a bailout with your taxes. Your taxes, conservative. Your taxes, liberal. Think that's fair? We're against corporate welfare, cry the progressives. We're against crony capitalism, cry the right-wingers in the auditorium. You know, it doesn't matter what you call it. They're against it. Okay, let's try the Patriot Act. Patriot Act replaced a bill in Congress after 9/11 that was duly considered by the Judiciary Committee in the House. But George W. Bush and Dick Cheney didn't think it was tough enough on dissent. So they sent up what turned out to be a Patriot Act, you know, panicked the Congress. Very easy to panic the Congress, especially when the media goes along with it. And they passed the Patriot Act. Okay, the Patriot Act is now the law of the land. Conservative, liberal. You think the government should have the right to search your home and not tell you for 72 hours? What says the right-winger? What says the progressive? Do you think government should have unfettered access to your medical records, your financial records, your library records, without probable cause? No way, says the liberal. No way, says the conservative. See what I mean? Okay, let's say the liberal wants more peace and the conservative likes to kick ass, to use George Herbert Walker Bush's favorite phrase, overseas, kick ass. You say, well, you know what the Pentagon budget is? It's about $650 billion, not counting other departments like Department of Energy and so forth. What would you say if the government bought something that before it was delivered came in 3-4 times the price? What would you say if I could show you that these big contractors are bleeding taxpayers blind? Well, I like to kick ass, but I'd like my tax dollars to be used efficiently. I'm with you on that. Well, that's a big first step. Because if you strain out the swollen waste, corruption, fraud, abuse, you know the phrases, maybe some of that money can be brought home to fix our public services, our schools, our clinics, our libraries, our roads, bridges, public transit. Well, now, who's for that? A better question is, who's against that? Chamber of Commerce wants this kind of infrastructure. Labor unions want it. The local officials want it. The politicians, everybody wants it. They don't like to go on their way to work down the street and break their axle on a pothole that hasn't been repaired because there's no money for it. Or a school where the desks are broken. And some of these inner city schools, if you describe them, people from third world countries wouldn't believe it. There's an inner city school I visited in Chicago where they froze in the winter. They kept their jackets on. The desks were broken. They didn't have enough space in the classroom. They were spilling out in the corridor. The roof was leaking. And you looked out the door and you saw the gleaming skyscrapers of corporate Chicago. It's just a lack of organization. It's a lack of enough people having a higher estimate of their own significance as civic human beings to reach the 1% or a fraction of 1% level. Now, to illustrate this, let's say to the right-wingers and the liberals, whatever, in this auditorium, do you know anything about business? Yeah, well, you know, my uncle, my aunt has a business, I have a business. Do you know any business that shouldn't be audited? No, of course not. Every business should be audited, both for the business sake as well as other people who lend them money or whatever. Well, isn't it news to you? Did you know that the Pentagon is the only government agency that doesn't submit an audit to the Government Accountability Office of the U.S. Congress, the GAO? And did you know that the Pentagon is violating federal law since 1992 by not auditing its books and releasing a public audit to the Congress, who's responsible for the appropriations process, or the public? And did you know that every Secretary of Defense has stated that the Pentagon should be audited, but somehow never gets audited? And do you know the consequences of what happens when a budget that big, 600 and some billion dollars growing, is not audited? What? Well, here's one. The Pentagon admitted it could not locate and account for $9 billion in the first year after the criminal invasion in Iraq. That's with a B. You know, this is $9 billion, you know. They couldn't even account for it. The Air Force, about 15 years ago, was caught buying supplies in the billions of dollars that they had in warehouses around the country and world and didn't know about it because of a lack of an audit. Now, you think a liberal and a conservative are going to disagree on that? You see how we're manipulated by the forces of power? And aren't we ashamed of ourselves that we allow ourselves to be manipulated like that with these little slogans that they throw at us? You know what politicians do to us? Here's what they do to us. They flatter us, they flummox us, and they fool us. They fool us. And none of us want to admit it. If you see a politician who doesn't flatter you, you're looking at one. That's the only one running for national office that told people, look in the mirror. You have the power. The Constitution starts with we the people, not we the corporations. not we the Congress. You have the votes. You have the power. You have a common value system far greater than you think. You know when someone likes to stir up in your neighborhood, in your family, divide and rule. Haven't you had a relative divide siblings or something for the time being, just to get their way? Why do you let these corporate executives locked in to Washington, the union of the plutocracy and the oligarchy, with Washington officials can't wait to get out and get high-paying jobs in corporations? Why wouldn't you be sensitive to that? Because they don't spend enough time on their democracy. They don't spend enough time on their politics. Except to say that politics is a dirty word. And why are they surprised when they get dirty politics? That's what I mean when I say people give up on themselves. Whether it's left, right. A few of them have the fervor. They start the Tea Party. They scare heck out of the Republicans. They have inordinate influence in the House, 30 of them. They drive the Republican speaker nuts. He quits. Now they're driving Paul Ryan nuts. What is it that they know? It's called energy. It's called political energy. It's called digging in. It's called signaling that you're not going to be dissuaded with a lollipop. That's what's lacking on the progressive side. So in this book, which is the shortest book I've written, because I want people to see it as an engine. This is an engine. I want people to buy it like a six-pack so they can go back home and get some people in the neighborhood around it or in the school. So they say, okay, Nader, you're making all these optimistic things here. You give some examples from the past. We live in a different time. We live in a period where you can't even get people out to a town meeting if it affects their own personal interest, for heaven's sake. Half of the people don't vote in presidential elections. 2/3 of them don't vote in most primaries. Some primaries have 8% turnout. This is what our founding fathers and U.S. Marines fought for, huh? Okay, so I have all kinds of examples, and they're very short, and I'll give you a couple of them. You know about these corporate universities that are 90 to 95% funded by the taxpayer, and they lure these students in, and they promise them jobs, and they hit them with huge tuitions, and the students can't make it, and they go into student loans, and the taxpayer pays the bulk of huge profits, multi-million-dollar salaries. David Halpern, Washington, D.C., he starts to drive, he's a lawyer, and he has informed the press, he's pressured the Department of Education, the Congress. The first two have gone bankrupt, and they're not the only ones, these corporate universities, funded by us. Multi-million-dollar salaries, lavish private jets and benefits. One person. Dr. Sidney Wolfe. You heard of Dr. Sidney Wolfe? Has caused the recall of all kinds of deadly drugs. Sometimes it took him 20, 25 years. Painkillers are killing people. He's at our health research group. He came out of National Institutes of Health. He decided he wasn't going to be a conventional doctor. He was going to be a public action doctor. And so he monitors the Food and Drug Administration. They're terrified of him. They even put him on their advisory committee for 3-4 years. He's rarely ever been caught with a mistake. He puts out books called Worst Pills, Best Pills. So you've got all the approved drugs that you get, but some have bad side effects, some have far less, so worst pills, best pills. There are millions of bits of information in that compendium, and it's online, and the drug companies are watching with laser beam focus to catch them. They haven't caught them. One person. Okay? Let's try Ralph Nader. By the way, You haven't heard of most of these people? Because they really get things done. They're not Amy Schumer, who just got millions of dollars for her pornographic book, goes to huge auditoriums, full, gets huge speech fees, high name recognition, and she tells people things like she's finally stopped her boyfriend and told him no more oral sex. This is the definition of the heroic, right? But not Sidney Wolfe, not David Halpern. How about Michael Jacobson? He came out of MIT. I interviewed him in the early 70s for a job in Washington. So what's your interest? He's a PhD, biochemistry, MIT. What's your interest? He said, food. I said, okay. Are you in it for the long run, or you just want to embellish your vitae that you came down to Washington and work, and then you're going to go work for Procter & Gamble or something? He said, I'm in it for the long run. He's still at it. He started the Center for Science in the Public Interest. He's revolutionized nutrition in this country. He has a 1 million circulation newsletter, Nutrition Action. He's been on national TV repeatedly, impact on Congress, impact on Food and Drug Administration. One person. He has a staff. He has 30, 40 people. I'm sure he has followers around the country. He has an event from time to time called Food Day, mobilizing people around the country around issues of food safety, food nutrition, too much salt, too much fat, too much sugar. But he was the progenitor when I gave him that kind of opportunity. Have you heard of Ralph Hotchkiss? How many here have heard of Justin Bieber? How many here have heard of Lady Gaga? Okay. All right, this is what Ralph Hotchkiss has done. He's riding a bike in a high school in Illinois, Rockford. He hits a rut, flips over, becomes a paraplegic. He applies to Oberlin to major in engineering. I go to Oberlin to speak. And I'm walking out of the lecture hall, and I hear a wheelchair behind me. And he catches up to me. He's a finishing sophomore. And he said, my name is Ralph Hotchkiss, very diffident person. And I'd like to spend the summer with you in Washington. I said, what do you want to do? He said, I want to reinvent the wheelchair. I said, what? He said, you know, wheelchairs are controlled by a monopoly called the Jennings Corporation in London. And they're crummy. They're high-priced, they break down, and they're terrible on anything but flat floors, like hospital floors or whatever. And people need wheelchairs, especially in developing countries, on undulating pathways, not just smooth pavement. So he goes there, he starts the Center for Concerned Engineering. He starts inventing all these things. He gives them away to the Veterans Administration. Anybody can use them. On strong, sturdy wheelchairs using inexpensive materials. Long story short, with a few colleagues, he breaks the grip of the Jennings Corporation and starts manufacturing facilities in the U.S. Then he connects with San Francisco State, where they give him space for his workshops and students. Now listen to this. This is what shames us as a society and as human beings. The doctors say to him, Ralph, you're not doing that well. You may become a quadriplegic. He said, well, I'd rather not. But if I do, I'll learn more about the needs of quadriplegics. This is the definition of the heroic, right? In this country, who's heroic? Misbehaving athletes? Wayward actors? People who grovel in the low-grade sensuality of the depravity of human beings? People who use dirty language? See, shame is a much greater motivation than guilt. And shame has got to be ingested by all of us who believe that we can do better as active citizens. Wherever, neighborhood, local, state, regional, national. To finish the Ralph Hotchkiss story, he got a MacArthur Genius Award. He spent 20 years by himself going to places like Nicaragua, Central Asia, developing countries, teaching people, mostly women it turns out, how to build wheelchairs from local materials by themselves. And then he learns that they start teaching him. They start finding even more improvements. You can't believe what this wheelchair is like. It does everything but fly. He was at one of our events in Washington last May, and he was on the stage at Constitution Hall, historic Constitution Hall. And he described the state of wheelchair need. There are 70, 80 million people in the world who desperately need wheelchairs, or it's a death sentence. And they're not enough. We export bombs, helicopter gunships, napalm, drones. Imagine living under drones 24 hours a day. You hear that sound, you don't know whether you're next. That's America. Land of the free, home of the brave. Producing more disasters, more violence all over the world. Because we're sitting at home watching screens. Because we've given up on ourselves. Because we don't believe that 1% can change this whole thing. So he was on the stage in his wheelchair, and he had a elevated block of metal. And he said, if you don't believe me about this wheelchair, watch, I'm going to try to break it. And he goes up and comes down like with a thunderous sound. And he goes up, comes down, nothing broke. One person. I won't go more because a lot of them are in here. And look at the paradox. We own the public airways. We own 1/3 of America, the public lands, plus offshore. The people own. The government administers it. We own the trillions of dollars of our taxes that built Google and Intel and Facebook and Oracle and the aerospace industry and half of the drug industry out of Washington. Research and development. We own trillions of those dollars. We get nothing in return other than high prices for those products or manipulation. When are we going to demand reciprocity for our tax dollars? If we're giving away the public airways, we're the landlords. The FCC is our real estate agent, and because of congressional pressure by the broadcast industry, they pay nothing for their license. How much do you pay for your auto license? $75? That's $75 more than the biggest NBC station in New York pays the FCC for control of 365 days a year, 24/7, deciding who gets on and who doesn't get on TV. Now, why do we allow that? Why do we give away our property? Business doesn't give away its property. Why don't we have a deal where we say, well, you can have 20 hours, we want 4 hours for an audience network. We want producers, reporters, editors, we want stations all over the country where 4 hours a day we have our own media. Professional, broad-based, significant, without any advertising revenue restraint, because we're going to pay for it by charging you rent for the other 20 hours. You know, I went through 8 years elementary, 4 years high school, 4 years college, 3 years law school. We never discussed the fact that the people of this country own the greatest wealth in this country. It's not the top 1%. It's not Wall Street. The people own trillions of dollars of pension money. That owns 1/3 of Wall Street in terms of shares. We own the public lands, as I said, the public airways, trillions of dollars of R&D. The commons, as they're called, is now exploding in the internet. But we don't control what we own. Now, do you think that's a radical idea? You're in this auditorium, you got right-wingers, you got liberals, and you say, hey, do you think that we should control what we own? Most of them would say, yeah, that's a pretty good idea. If I own a car, I'd like to control it. If we have a park down the neighborhood, I think the people should have a big say in what that park is used for, or what that public swimming pool is used for. So that's where we come in. We have great assets, we have good historical precedent, we have the 1% or less morale builder, we have access to all kinds of facts, it's one thing the internet is good for, and we have a common shared base of values. Now, obviously, as things proliferate in terms of a more progressive, just economy, there will be differences of opinion. Once we get full Medicare for all, free choice of doctor and hospital, there will be handoff issues that people are going to disagree with. Wouldn't you like to disagree there instead of when we don't have full Medicare for all? Whether a certain remedy should be covered by Medicare or not, that's going to be disagreed. But at least nobody dies anymore in the United States of America because they can't afford health insurance. Think of this. We brag about in our schools, we're number one. That's the way they control us. We're like number 38 in infant mortality, 22 in wages, give or take. We're losing ground everywhere. We're the world's greatest debtor. We were the world's greatest creditor in 1980. So we're talking about the following. You go to Luxembourg, France, Norway, Canada, Japan, Taiwan. You go to Scandinavia. Nobody dies because they can't afford health insurance. In this country, 800 people a week die because they cannot afford health insurance to get diagnosed and treated in time. Who weeps for them? Who goes on TV? What politician goes to their funerals? This is what I mean by liberating our mind to search for the facts and connecting, instead of giving up on ourselves and saying, oh me, oh my, que sera, sera, whatever will happen will be. You can't fight City Hall, you can't take on Exxon Mobil. Well, if we have that attitude, how are our descendants going to look at us? You accumulate all these withdrawals from civic life, and you connect them to the deterioration of our world and our culture and our society. You know how our descendants are going to look at us? They're going to curse us. That's the way they're going to look at us. So we have all these assets. So how do we get it going? Small groups. The head of the Tennessee Valley Authority in the 1930s, his name was Arthur Morgan, and he kept saying to himself, how do we get things changed for a better society? So he goes all over the world to find the answers. He goes to India, he goes to Denmark, he goes to China, he goes to Brazil, he goes to Canada. And he has all his notes, he comes back, and his answer as to how things get started is the title of his little book. It's called The Small Community. That's how it happens. Now, when the small community doesn't have to reach more than 1% of the people, how can you not be excited? How can you not rush out and triple your numbers? We always thought that the way you get people doing things is the pain-pleasure principle. But if you're deeply disillusioned about your ability to count, to make a difference, you'll take more pain and avoid the pleasure. Because you think the pleasure is impossible. Can't fight City Hall. Weehawken, New Jersey, 100 people. When I said to him, I said, what if you had 100 people like you? When you went to the town meeting, there'd be 100 people. When you plan to revive this community, transform it, bring it up to date, restore it, repair it, There'll be 100 people who really mean business. That's their main hobby in life, besides their job. He almost fell on the floor. He said, 100 people? I can't believe it. We could change Weehawken, New Jersey. Because they had the public sentiment on their side. So this is what this little book's about. The most important part of it is easier than we think. It's easier when you think. Now there are people who come from Western Europe, and they're all excited by Hollywood, and New York City, and Silicon Valley, and then they stay a while. And they say, what? You don't have this? You have student loans? $50,000, $60,000, $70,000? We don't have student loans in France or Germany or Scandinavia. They do now in Britain because they're adopting our model. You say, what? They say to us, you don't have paid maternity leave? Even people working for government agencies? What? We have weeks and weeks of maternity leave. And they say, what? You don't have the right for a paid vacation? And all workers? In Sweden, it's 7 weeks paid vacation. They don't know what to do with it. It's so much time. And you say, what? You don't have a decent pension? You don't have a bus that you can go regularly to Waterbury or Torrington? No public transit? What? Your poorest third workers are far poorer than ours? What's going on here? You don't have full insurance? You got to battle all kinds of billings, decoys. You can't understand them. They're in code. They're stealing you blind, I hear. We just have a card, like in Canada. And healthcare is $4,500 per capita a year. In this country, it's $94, $9,400 average. Double the price, and millions of people not covered, tens of millions undercovered. Canada, everybody's covered. They get better outcomes because they don't die because they don't have health insurance. And it's half the price. Why did Western Europe get all these things and more? Because after World War II, they were devastated and we were untouched. We were the prime power in the world. And they had to rebuild. They had stronger unions than we had. They had co-ops, big ones, and we didn't. They had a multi-party system. They didn't just have two parties. They had proportional representation. If the Green Party gets over 5%, Germany gets over 5% of the parliament. Green Party gets 30% here, gets nothing. 40%. In short, they had the institutions for recovery from their most devastated period in their history, World War II. And we have none of these for all the people. We have some unions, paid vacation. Basically, we have none of these examples that I spoke about. Paid family leave in the Netherlands, you get a year pay. Take care of your ailing parent. Stay home, take care of your ailing parent. They're smarter than we are. They're richer than we are. They had a different level of expectation that they directed toward the politicians. They had the leverage of multi-parties. They had strong unions. And they were determined to get something for their tax dollars. For all the tax rebels in this country, they just want lower taxes. They never ask, why don't we get more for the taxes that we pay? Okay, so I'm going to end on this note. And that is that we all have a responsibility to get people out. Once you get people out, everything follows. That's the difference. And we're all open to ideas. There is nobody who has the patent on getting people out. There may be 100 ways to get people out. One works here, one doesn't work there. But we have huge experience in events where people don't show up. And we've thought a lot about it. And it is everywhere, by the way. It's not just here. At Harvard Law School, at lunch is when they get outside speakers. And they're, you know, Harvard can attract very prominent speakers. The students will not show up unless you give them free pizza. These are law students. These are the leaders of their forthcoming profession. So it is a very ingrained problem. That's one reason why we don't have more co-ops, because people don't show up. More unions, because people don't show up. Better candidates, because people don't show up. And yet, we are blessed with all these assets, all these capabilities to build what can be called the just society. And that really is the ultimate purpose, isn't it? Without justice, you don't have liberty and freedom. Usually, they turn it around. No, without justice, you don't have a chance for liberty and freedom. And Marcus Cicero told us that over 2,000 years ago when he defined freedom as participation in power. Isn't that a great definition? Because freedom now is used as a manipulative word by unscrupulous politicians. I want to give you freedom. But personal freedom is quite different than civic freedom. And Cicero was talking about freedom is participation in power. So if we're burdened by our knowledge, we are perhaps more welcoming to a little ditty by a 14th century Ming Dynasty philosopher out of China. You know, I'm really amazed at the wisdom of the ancients. They had no telephone, no email, no TV. How were they so wise? They were wise because they had time to think. And he comes up with this little aphorism: to know and not to do is not to know. Now, you could critique that as a gross exaggeration, but the essence of it is there's a moral obligation, if you know something, to do something about it for the betterment of our fellow human beings. Thank you. Okay. It's your time. Yeah.
I have a question about something you brought up at the end about proportional representation,
Yeah.
which is one solution. The other solution that is commonly talked about is instant runoff voting.
Right.
How would you compare and contrast those in terms of value at different levels of government?
Well, it's a very good suggestions, because anybody who says that this is not the time to vote third party, you say to the Democrats like Bill Curry, why haven't you supported instant runoff voting? That takes care of it. Ranked voting. You vote for your first, second, third choice. And until a majority wins, a candidate with a majority, they go to your second choice and so forth. So the so-called spoiler, a bigoted word, disappears. Now some towns have, San Francisco has a single instant runoff voting. I don't particularly like that, because it leaves with a third party with zero at the end of the day, because you know, they go to the second, third. But I like to torture Democrats. Because what they're really saying is, they don't want your kind of challenge. Shut up. Don't you know that they own the votes that you're getting? See, it's very bigoted. The one I like is proportional representation, because it gives a small party a chance to grow. When you have a winner take all, it doesn't give you a chance to grow from one election to another. It makes people confront you with short expectation levels. You only got 3% of the vote, go home, don't try again. So you can't grow. So I am definitely for that. Now there are some towns that essentially have single, for example, in Hartford, Charlene, correct me if I'm wrong on that. In Hartford, you don't run at large, do you? The top 7 people win. The top 7 vote getters win. That's not exactly proportional, but you see what I mean?
Mhm.
And so if you got just 15% of the vote, but you were in the top 7, you'd go to city council.